said about Cuba. But that was a signal. That was an opening. It was a coded signal delivered in public. But in private, we now know the plans for these secret talks were on. Will Atwood had been given the go-ahead to start the process of talking directly to Fidel Castro. He had not made the logistical arrangements yet of how he was going to get to Havana, but he had sent word to Havana that what they needed in order to get those talks started was a clear statement from Fidel Castro of what exactly he wanted to talk about. They needed to know his agenda for what would be discussed, and then William Atwood would go at the behest of President Kennedy, and those secret talks could start. The back channel would open. And Fidel Castro came back to Will Atwood with what he asked, with his proposed agenda for what he wanted to talk about at their first secret talk in Havana. And that reply from Fidel Castro arrived for Will Atwood in the United States on November 23rd, 1963, which is 5 days after John F. Kennedy gave that speech in Miami and 1 day after John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas. Will Atwood did an interview, sort of an oral history, with JFK's presidential library after Kennedy died, in which he explained this whole sequence of events. His role as the secret intermediary, the secret messenger between Fidel Castro and John Kennedy, the negotiations and machinations around that, leading right up until the day that President Kennedy was killed as the arrangements were being made. And then, as Atwood told JFK's library, quote, nothing ever came of it. He says he did write it all up at the time. He wrote up a memo on what he had done and what had been left hanging from Castro at the time of Kennedy's death. He wrote it up in a memo that he gave to Adlai Stevenson, who by then was UN ambassador. And all of that happened more than 50 years ago now. And now today, looking at these images of President Obama and his family arriving in Havana, it is almost unbelievable that it has been nearly 90 years since an American president has set foot in Cuba. I mean, that's astonishing given just how physically close Cuba is to our country, even if you know nothing else about our two nations. But the intrigue and the political effort that it took to make this happen is multi-generational. I mean, even this breakthrough that President Obama has engineered, even just over the last few years, it still took secret meetings, negotiations brokered in part personally by the Pope, undercover talks between Cuban and U.S. officials at random anonymous office buildings in Ottawa, in Canada. The top U.S. negotiators, two U.S. negotiators involved in the initial opening of discussions, they were told to come up with cover stories for those meetings in Canada, even for members of their own immediate families. They were not allowed to tell their own families what they were doing on these trips to Canada, where they were secretly meeting with Cuban officials. They were reporting directly to the president. The pathway to today's visit by President Obama and the opening of relations between our countries, it involved spy swaps on both sides and prisoner releases. It took utmost political intrigue and secrecy. And you know what? The results after all of this for this first visit, very awkward, including physically awkward. I mean, today, look at this, at the press conference between President Castro and President Obama, you know, physically awkward, personally awkward, and obviously politically difficult. There were moments of legitimate suspense and confusion and ultimately anger today when American political reporters put Raul Castro on the spot about political prisoners being held in Cuba, and he professed that there were none, and that if anybody knows of any, they should give him their names, and those political prisoners would be released within a day. Right, yeah. This is difficult and it is strange. And the Cuban government and its economy, if not its people, have been trapped in a time capsule for nearly half a century now. And nobody knows quite what will happen to the Cuban economy or to the Cuban government now that the time capsule has been cracked. But President Bill Clinton tried to open up relations with Cuba and failed. President Carter tried to open up relations with Cuba and failed. President Kennedy was in the act of trying to find a way to open up Cuba, literally as one of his last active, if covert,